Hello, everyone. Pleasure to be with you. My name is Blake Poland. I'm in the Dalla School of Public Health at the University of Toronto, and I'm really delighted to have a few minutes with you to explore this topic of mutual interest around what is social change? How do we understand it? What are the levers of change? Um, what are some of the assumptions we bring to the social change work that we do, and where are we being invited to rethink some of those assumptions and perhaps consider other options and alternatives that might be more empowering for ourselves and for those around us. So I'm going to take a couple of minutes to do that. And so I'll just share my screen here and we'll get started. So I'm going to jump right in and just wanted to raise a few things about how we typically think about change and how it comes about. And usually we're motivated to reduce harm. We might even see humanity as some kind of blight on the planet, that we've got to minimize our impact and get with the program, and that there are a whole bunch of things we need to give up in order to live more lightly with a reduced footprint, etc. So this is very much the message we get these days from environmentalism. And with it comes a whole lot of baggage about how change work is done, that it's hard work, that we can often burn out trying to make change happen, that there's so few people who know what's going on, the amount of work to be done to educate everyone is just simply overwhelming. And that change is linear and predictable. So you can compare the amount of energy you put into this with the expected returns or impact and decide for yourself whether it's worth it or not. And quite frankly, a lot of people use that calculus, that kind of thinking, and figure, what's the difference I can make? It's a drop in the bucket. So why, smash my head against the wall for such a tiny impact? I'm not even going to bother. So we end up being unlikely to act if it seems like it won't make a difference. And we tend to think of hope as a prerequisite for action. So if I have some kind of hope for the future, that'll spring me into action of some kind. But some emerging perspectives sourced from very different kinds of understandings are suggesting something rather different. That instead of simply reducing harm, we can set ourselves a goal of being of mutual benefit, or what's sometimes referred to as regenerative sustainability, or notions of reciprocity. So actually, we have a purpose here in the universe. We're all connected. We're not here by accident, and we have something to contribute. And we can actually make not just our world, but the world for everyone and all living beings a more marvelous, magical place than it already is. And that crisis is an opportunity to create the kind of society we always wanted. We've been down this path of the so-called American dream, and it hasn't produced what we were promised it would be. So fine, let's rethink things and see what is possible. So what if social change was about doing what you love and inviting others to join you? I've got the slogan there from that transition town movement. If it's not fun, it's not sustainable. And I suspect they meant that in both senses of the word sustainable. And what if a few trigger events could spark a rapid change in awareness and willingness to act? So it's not just an overwhelming slog, endless slog to try and get everyone who seems so apathetic to engage in change work. And what if social change was actually almost always nonlinear and unpredictable? That we've been building a critical mass for a while, and that does take time sometimes, but that social tipping points can come surprisingly quickly. And I think during COVID, we've seen an example of that a lot of things that we were previously told were completely unfeasible and not worth considering have now come on the table, like guaranteed annual income. And what if what we do and how we are in the world is an expression of alignment with what we value? So instead of doing this calculus of measuring our effort against the anticipated impact, we just act in ways that make sense for us because that's who we are. That's our expression of our alignment and our commitments in the world, regardless of what the ripple effects of that are. And quite frankly, often we don't know what the ripple effects are. So why assume they're minimal or non-existent? And so what we find is very much what Bill McKibben and others have started writing about, which is that hope is actually, rather than being a prerequisite for action, is actually generated through action. And I found this myself, that the more engaged I am in change work, in making a difference, in inviting people into the things that I love, the more hopeful I feel for the future. So with that, what I'd like to do is dip into a talk that I gave last year that I think will provide some fodder for consideration around how we might rethink social change in a couple of very tangible ways. And so what I want to bring forward here is what I kind of a bit blasé referred to as a 3-point plan for reinventing environmentalism and social change that was presented at a conference last year at UTM. And it takes as its point of departure that this is what we've collectively created on the planet at the moment. This is what we euphemistically refer to as civilization. And the emerging threats to planetary health and health equity in the form of climate change, ecological degradation, resource depletion, energy insecurity, and widening socioeconomic disparities are some of the outputs of that globalized neoliberal capitalist system. I particularly like this cartoon in the vein of, you know, a picture tells a story of 1,000 words. This one is by Toronto-based cartoonist Tony Biddle, and we see that the data show us a very similar picture, that our impact on the environment is rising exponentially, especially in the post-war period, and that it continues to rise exponentially. And scientists have now started to put a timeline on cascading ecosocial collapse as really accelerating sometime between 2025 and 2045. That used to seem like a little ways off, but we're 2020 now. It doesn't seem very far away anymore, certainly within the lifetimes of all of us, I would imagine, at least what we'd like to think it would be. So this is cause for concern and not a problem, you know, that our grandchildren are facing. And what's our response been in mainstream society and in public health, the field that I'm in? It's by and large been risk management. It's the default modus operandi of public health and all of our major institutions, but it's proving increasingly ineffective and in fact counterproductive. It's mostly about maintaining the status quo, framing, for example, resilience as capacity to bounce back from adversity. And it's about prediction and control, and it's about minimizing the spin-off effects of our current system, which is another way of saying it's about buying the current system more time, which we don't really have the luxury of doing for too much longer. And what we know is that control is increasingly elusive. We're living in an interconnected and complex world, and the impacts of our actions are accelerating in scope and reach and magnitude with each passing year. And as Thomas Homer Dixon, the author of The Upside of Down, pointed out in that book and in others, is that the more we go along this path, the more effort is required to prop up the status quo. So we have what he refers to as sunk costs in the current system. And of course, the more we invest in propping up the status quo, the more reluctant we are to change course. And we're seeing that all around us with a redoubling of efforts to restart economic growth and and prop up what we call the economy, etc. But I think what many of us are increasingly realizing is that a deeper paradigm shift is required. Something more ecozoic, something more like what David Corton calls the Great Turning. Joanna Macy uses that term as well, or something that others refer to as conscious evolution. In other words, not trying to solve the world's problems with the same level of thinking that created them, to loosely quote or paraphrase Albert Einstein. So we had a couple of projects to explore this: pedagogy for the Anthropocene, and some work associated with that. Roxy was involved in this work. We had a great team looking at kind of how do we reimagine learning and change work, education for activists in the context of the Anthropocene, and what kinds of land-based learning would help support that. And I would like to think that some of the things that are at the core, rooted in Rising, arose in part from our experience with this project. We went on to develop another project called Many Lenses for Planetary Health, where we we're trying to reinvent conventional citizen engagement processes for sustainable futures by seeding discussion with new ways of seeing based on Indigenous talking circle methodology. That project's just wrapped up. We're just writing about it now, but I just wanted to share these as a couple of examples of what we've been trying to do, working with some of these ideas. And so, based on, in part on that, and some other reading and thinking and so on that I've done for the last couple of years, it seems to me that we could boil some of this down into kind of three promising directions from an emerging, and in some ways also very established but largely ignored landscape of possibility of ideas and other ways of knowing and doing. And the three are here, and I'm going to jump into them in each in more detail. So the first really is about decolonizing. Not just decolonizing our landscapes and our relations with Indigenous peoples and our institutions, but also decolonizing ourselves, because the dominant Western paradigm is lodged firmly in our psyche in the form of the kinds of stories that we tell ourselves about who we are and where we're headed, and what's possible, what we invest time and energy in, how we're socialized to think about things in ways that naturalize inequality and competition, domination and scarcity, and that in a way that invites us to kind of ask whose stories count, who gets to tell them, who's listening, and how are they heard, and what are the impacts of those stories in terms of what we can imagine collectively as a shared future. And I want to note in that context that a lot of what several authors like Charles Eisenstein and others, Mark Hathaway, et cetera, have started to point to is that the underlying story here is one of separation and disconnection from each other, from the natural world, enabled through consumerism and urbanism, et cetera, but allowing also that consumerism because the visceral kind of hole that's created in our existential kind of experience of life from that disconnection, is being exploited to get us to keep buying things and reaching for the top, et cetera. And it's not a hole that can be filled in that way, but it certainly serves the interests of the dominant elite who benefit the most from the current globalized capitalist system and its very unequal apportioning of resources and the spoils of the economy, to have us think that we can resolve our deep existential angst in that way, an angst that actually can only be restored through coming into right relationship with each other in the natural world. And I note that, in many ways, this kind of separation from each other and disconnection from community, et cetera, are in some senses problems of privilege. Only people who can afford to meet all their needs in the marketplace can afford to have no relationships that they have to rely on. And for everyone else, indeed, throughout history, community and relationships based on reciprocity is what has enabled our survival. And it's what arguably will enable our survival in the coming decades. So fortunately, we have quite a bit of inspiration we can draw from non-dominant knowledge traditions from all around the world to help us with this problem of separation and disconnection and reimagining the world with different kinds of stories about what is true and what is possible. And some of those come from critical and progressive traditions at the margins in the global north. The degrowth movement, political ecology, critical race theory, ecofeminism. Some come from earth traditions at the margins in the global north that have been long buried historically. Deep ecology, neo-paganism, druidry, animism in various forms. These were alive and well in early Europe before colonization practiced on its own turf, before being exported around the world. And a lot of these were exterminated through, the Christian Crusades and in many other ways. We also have indigenous ways of knowing that are very much about connection to the land and to our ancestors, the notion of all my relations, of the deep relatedness that surrounds us and the sacredness of all life. And we have a rich tradition of global South epistemologies that we rarely hear about here. Buen vivir, for example, or good living, Freirean critical pedagogy, liberation theology, collective health, and many others besides. Of course, there are always some dangers of cultural appropriation and how we pick those up. And the need for very real reconciliation and repatriation, Indigenous people sovereignty and unresolved land claims and other issues, and a need for genuine allyship. So there's no way in which this call for inner decolonization should take away in any way, shape, or form from those larger projects and the actions that are required to do that work. But when it comes to decolonizing, we do have a lot that we can draw on here that lets us know that there are other ways of knowing and seeing and appreciating the world around us. And in one of the questions that this raises in exploring this work is, what if sustainability crisis is not a technical problem, which is how it's usually presented, but actually a relationship problem? That perhaps we've fallen out of right relationship with ourselves, with each other, and with the more than human world. And as any of you know who've been around long enough to have had relationship problems, sometimes you don't fix them by manipulation, control, reward and punishment, etc. All the tools that conventional environmentalism uses, you solve them by coming into, right relationship as an exercise in reworking your basis for relatedness from the inside out. And this brings me to my second kind of basis for reforming conventional environmentalism and social change work, which is one of embracing animism and a relational worldview. So worldviews and ways of being that are common amongst indigenous peoples, as well as European neo-paganism, shamanism, Shinto traditions in Japan, see all life as animate, sentient, and possessing agency and spirit. And that if we hold that view, rather than nature and the non-human as simply being resources at our disposal for exploitation and profit making, then it completely changes our relationship to the rest of the world. A world that is fully alive, that speaks to us and that works together to co-create reality is really quite a different world from the one that modern Western culture sees as a world of things or resources at our disposal, with humans at the pinnacle of evolution, as opposed to one species amongst many. And so what if we not only learned about nature or in nature, but also from nature? What kind of deep listening to ourselves, to each other, to the land, to intuition, etc., engenders transformative change? And what's the quality of being from which we source our knowing and doing? This is really a key question that I've been sitting with in the last couple of years. And it's not one that I pretend to have all the answers to, but I think it's really key in some important ways. And I'll circle back to this in my next set of points. So the third, I think, ingredient here that is super interesting is thinking about how we might use or draw on recent understandings from quantum science to help us rethink the nature of social change itself. And I'm drawing here on the work of cosmologist Brian Swimme, MIT's Peter Senge, Nobel Prize winner David Bohm, Joseph Jaworski, Otto Scharmer, and his Theory U program, and the U Lab at MIT, Joe Dispenza, and many others. And it's all predicated on this notion that at a very fundamental level, everything is energy and frequency. And in fact, the science and physics experiments show that at the level of atoms and particles, multiple possible futures already exist. And the shift from wave to particle, because energy is both at the same time, or from energy to matter, is activated through intention, because they do these experiments, you know, the classic slit experiment, where energy goes through as a wave, it comes out as a wave, but as soon as we look at it, it comes out as particles. And so that fixing of energy into matter is activated through attention and intention. And this has potentially profound implications. Most quantum scientists say that there's something fundamentally different about the world at the subatomic level than there is at the rest of existence at other levels. And yet all those other levels are made up of the subatomic level. So what if actually the entire nature of existence followed these principles? Most of us are on autopilot. We're not particularly mindful of our own inner emotional microclimate and its impacts on our own health, our well-being, our gene expression. Actually, there's research to show that our emotions affect genes get turned on and off that are responsible for disease or suppression of disease. And how does our emotional microclimate impact those around us? So activism is often understandably fueled by anger and outrage. And there's so much to be upset about at the moment and to want to take action on. So it's totally understandable. And yet I do find myself wondering, what kind of energy are we putting out in the world? And I know that can sound like a hugely privileged kind of question to even ask, to spin this in what seems like very new agey terms. But I think if you'll bear with me for a minute, you'll see that actually the implications for social change work are quite profound. And by way of illustrating this a little bit, the now famous work of Masaru Emoto on water, very detailed microscopic photography of water structure that changes profoundly based on what kind of energy we're sending it. So on the one image there, people were asked to kind of be with water and just kind of hold this thought of, you make me sick, and everything that that feels and what that brings up. And you see how ugly and chaotic that image is. And on the other hand, when we allow ourselves to feel love and gratitude, you can see how the structure of the water molecules themselves change dramatically on the lower right there. And it is suggestive that in fact our emotions and our the energy that we put out has an impact on everything around us. And given that we're 90+% water, why wouldn't it also impact us and other people and those around us? So the HeartMath Institute in the US very large research institute dedicating itself to understanding this phenomenon of what they call heart coherence. You can see these heart rhythm patterns on the lower right there, kind of jagged, incoherent when one is in a space of frustration, anxiety, worry, irritation, but smooth out when we're in a more heart coherent space or connected with gratitude, appreciation, love, relaxation. So the funny thing about the quantum field is that everything works in terms of morphic resonance. So we literally pull towards us that which is a vibrational match for our current state of consciousness. And so some people, Joe Dispenza and others, have started to kind of come up with these formulas almost to say, well, if you have a clear intention and you bring an elevated emotion to that, and heart coherence and presence, then you can actually begin to manifest better health, remissions in medical conditions, deep healing, life-changing experiences, and much more. And I've experienced some of this myself, enough to be quite intrigued and convinced of the potential of this. So obviously, this is not always the panacea. It can be taken a little too literally. So there's some caveats that we need to make. This is not, first of all, about wishful thinking. Wishing is about trying to get something that you don't have. So actually what you're putting out or what you're connecting to is that state of lack, that you don't have it. So working with the quantum field is actually about getting to a space where it's already true, right? And that you can actually feel the potential of that, because that's what, when you tune into that possible future in the quantum field of all possible futures, you attract that possible future out of the many possibilities towards you through morphic resonance. At least that's the hypothesis that the quantum science points to. And the portal into the quantum field is the radical eternal present moment. So surrendering to the present moment means leaving behind our attachments and our identity, at least temporarily, and becoming pure attention in a space. And not everyone's up for that. We derive our sense of self from the known, and working with the quantum field really means stepping into the unknown. So it's not for, everyone necessarily, but it's certainly possible for anyone, but it takes a certain level of commitment. And for most people, the present is simply a transient moment on the way from a familiar past to an all too depressingly familiar future. And the present moment is one that we rarely consciously inhabit. So starting to inhabit the present moment, getting connected with the here and now, can be a real shift in our point of anchoring in our lives. But when this starts to work, be prepared for your old reality to crumble as the new one comes into form. And that, that can be unsettling, kind of like our present moment globally, I would say. So I can't help but ask myself, if this works at the individual level, and I've seen evidence of it many times over, what about at the collective level? What would be possible through forms of entrainment and constructive interference, as it's called? We've seen this with clocks. If you put a whole bunch of grandfather clocks in the same room, after a while, they'll all begin swinging in the same tune, even though they didn't start out that way. And it's the same with people too, that you find that when people spend time together, they kind of align into the same kind of mood or orientation which might not have been the case initially. And there's actually some interesting energy explanations for how that happens. And now we have at least 50 demonstration projects and dozens of peer-reviewed articles with different projects using, for example, meditation to observe the effects of collective meditation on things like mortality, crime, fires, terrorism, and the Earth's magnetic field. and with startling results. And I put some of these here. I'm not going to read them all out, but it just is, to me, is very intriguing. What we can potentially do collectively, visualizing and creating the sustainable world that we all want from the quantum field. And I say this in part because a lot of energy and time at the moment within environmental circles is taken up with warning everyone about what we don't want. We don't want a world of runaway global warming. We don't want a world of runaway inequalities. We don't want a world of gated communities for the few and untold suffering for the many. We're very clear about what we don't want. But at some point, focusing all our energy on what we don't want seems to me like a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Can we harness some of what we now know about the quantum field and morphic resonance to devote some of our energy to getting clear about what we do want? Not just as some future pie in the sky, but actually feel it. Allow ourselves to feel it as if it was already here, and pull that possible future into existence through this process of morphic resonance. I think the possibilities are really intriguing. And so my question to you is, will you answer the call to adventure of the hero's journey to co-create what Charles Eisenstein calls the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible? And any of you are familiar with this notion of the hero's journey, originally brought forward, I think, by Joseph Campbell in his classic book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. This is kind of a classic rendition of the storyline in so many epic stories, including Homer's Odyssey and many others besides, and from many different cultures. And you can perhaps see where you are on this journey individually and where we are collectively at the moment. So I invite you maybe to reflect on what resonates for you and what we just heard. I covered a lot of ground, and obviously much more could be said about this. What do you find enlivening here? What grabs you? And what also alternatively elicits discomfort? And what opportunities and challenges do we face in bringing decolonization, animism, or relational worldview, and quantum physics into our work in sustainability and social change? And I leave you with just a few of the many things I could have put up here as suggested further reading, some of the sources that have very much inspired me in my work, and a few opportunities to connect and an invitation to connect around this work. I'd love to hear from you. And thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to share a few minutes with you, to share these ideas. And I look forward to hearing where this goes and to engaging with you on this topic as the opportunity arises. Thank you very much. Take care, and wishing you really all the best in this magnificent curated adventure that Rooting and Rising is. Take care. Bye for now.